pivotal moment in the militarization of the U.S. police. How do I begin? I suppose I want to begin by emphasizing the fact that the historical developments that have promoted the growth in the United States of solidarity with the Palestinian struggle help to strengthen the Black liberation movement. Oftentimes we think of solidarity as offering support to, but I'm looking at it from the vantage point of the way the efforts to extend this solidarity actually produced a stronger, more effective, more radical Black liberation movement. And before I say anything else in this context, and Noura, you know that I always evoke June Jordan, and I think I'll quote from her poem later on, but I want to say that June Jordan's indefatigable commitment to justice for Palestine continues to resonate today. She not only foreshadowed a moment when Black Palestinian solidarity would begin to flourish. She's an important part of a genealogy of the convergence of U.S. Black struggles and demands for Palestine, justice in Palestine over the last half century. And especially since June's death some 20 years ago, whenever I think about Black solidarity with Palestine, I feel the resonances of her words. And of course, this era has frequently been recognized as the era of Black Lives Matter. And I'm referring to more than the organization, the network, or the movement. I'm referring to a kind of historical mandate that took shape with the emergence of a new collective consciousness in the summer of 2020, in which solidarity with Palestine played no small role. And of course, Noura talked about some of the events leading up to that moment, the Ferguson protests in 2014 in the aftermath of the police killings of Mike Brown, where Palestinian activists on the ground in Palestine helped to give shape to a movement of international solidarity. Palestinians were the first to express solidarity with those struggling in protests, those struggling and protesting in Ferguson, and over the months and years that followed, people all over the world joined that movement of international solidarity. But let me say that if we were to attempt to construct a genealogy of the impact of the movement to free Palestine on the movement for Black freedom, we would have to examine what you might call the deprovincialization of the Black movement in the US and the related radicalization. And of course, you pointed out to Noura, and as a rule, it's the speech that Dr. King made exactly 1 year before his assassination at the Riverside Church that was entitled Beyond Vietnam, a Time to Break Silence, that is considered to be the defining moment of the conscious internationalization of the US Black movement. And of course, King was severely criticized for that. But what frequently goes unrecognized is the pressure exerted on Dr. King and on his organization, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And SNCC has already been mentioned several times. the pressure that SNCC exerted to link the Black freedom movement in the South to U.S. To struggles against U.S. imperialist ventures, especially the war in Vietnam. And as a matter of fact, in 1966, in January 1966, which was more than a year before King's Beyond Vietnam speech, SNCC became the first civil rights organization to speak out against the war in Vietnam. And despite the fact that Black organizations were severely criticized for moving beyond what was considered to be the purely domestic issues of ending racial segregation and calling for voting rights for Black people, SNCC and other radical organizations began increasingly to speak out on international issues, and especially on South Africa, and especially on Palestine, and particularly within a context, and this I think is so important, within a context that was anti-colonial and anti-capitalist, a context that recognizes racism as pivotal to the production and reproduction of capitalism. Now, a decade after SNCC took the lead in expressing solidarity with the Palestinian struggle, Andrew Young held a meeting which was unauthorized in 1970 with the representatives of the PLO. And as we know, this led to his forced resignation from his position as the US delegate to the United Nations under the Carter administration. And when he resigned, Andrew Young said, and I'm quoting, "I could not say to anybody that given the same situation, I would not do it again." And that's sort of a hidden moment in history, a kind of subjugated moment. And of course, the Carter then was not who he became as the ex-president. I mean, we could talk about that. But I think I want to make the point that there's always been a pronounced tension within Black movements in the US between calls to integrate, assimilate on the one hand, and strategies of radical transformation on the other. And in many ways, the more radical positions that understand colonialism and imperialism to be central to what is often represented as a purely domestic issue of racism. Those radical positions were always related to the cultivation of a sense of connectedness with global movements, and particularly in Africa and the Middle East, and of course, especially Palestine. So I think it's very important to point out that Vietnam was not the only issue that helped to deprovincialize Black struggles, and that there were there was a great deal of tension around Palestine. Bayard Rustin, for example, was an ardent supporter of the state of Israel. And of course, many people praise Bayard Rustin for many things, but they should also point out that he was very backward in that respect. And then, of course, as both of you have mentioned, Stokely Carmichael, who later changed his name to Kwame Ture, and the entire organization of SNCC called for solidarity with Palestine. And then where was Dr. King? Well, Dr. King was somewhere in the middle. he wasn't the Zionist that he has been represented as being. He was not the kind of supporter of Zionism that was that they tried to argue with the discovery of this so-called letter, which turned out to be a hoax.
Yeah.
But also he wasn't nearly as strong as he should have been on the issue of justice in Palestine. But I do want to make the point that when you consider rank and file participants in the radical wing of the Black movement during the late 1960s and the early 70s, virtually everyone was familiar with the struggle in Palestine. And this was in part due to the work of a couple of SNCC members, Charlie Cobb and Cortland Cox, who opened a bookstore in Washington and a publishing company called Drum and Spear Publishing Company. Now, I want to, in a few minutes, I want to talk a little bit about the significance of that. But first, I should say that we cannot forget the role played by Malcolm X in deprovincializing the struggle against racism at home. Malcolm X issued a warning against Zionism that really laid the foundation for a tradition of Black solidarity with Palestine that moved SNCC and the Black Panther Party to stand firmly on the side of justice with Palestine, despite widespread ideological pressures to uncritically support the state of Israel. Now, last year, we observed the 50th anniversary of the assassination of George Jackson by San Quentin guards. And we took note then, as Greg Thomas has reminded us in his project, George Jackson and the Son of Palestine, that a copy of the poetry anthology Enemy of the Sun, Poetry of Palestinian Resistance, that was edited by Nasir Aruri and Edmund Garib, was one of the 99 books discovered in George's cell. However, a copy of the poem, the actual poem Enemy of the Sun, from which the anthology took its title, was also discovered in George's cell in his own handwriting. Yeah. And I guess nobody connected the handwritten version with the poem by Samir al-Kazim. So the Black Panther Party credited the Enemy of the Sun to George Jackson. And, sometimes mistakes can be wonderful. Sometimes mistakes can be revealing. Yeah. And so this was quite a phenomenal mistake that attributed words of Palestinian resistance to a pivotal figure in the struggle for abolition and Black freedom in the US. And so I just want to quote a couple of those words. You may take the last strip of my land, feed my youth to prison cells. You may plunder my heritage. You may burn my books, my poems, or feed my flesh to the dogs. You may spread a web of terror on the roofs of my village, O enemy of the sun. But I shall not compromise. And to the last pulse in my vein, I shall resist. And of course, the conclusion of each stanza consists of the words, I shall not compromise. And to the last pulse in my veins, I shall resist, resist, and resist. When I think about the moment of the assassination of George Jackson, I imagine that these may have been the words that were echoing through his heart and mind as he was gunned down by San Quentin guards on August 7th, 1970, the occasion for which is now known as Black August. So here I see Palestinian resistance energizing and buttressing Black resistance. And this is the work of solidarity. Now, in the context of the anniversary of George's assassination last August, it was the 50th anniversary. So I took another look at the list of 99 books. And I realized that he also had a book of poetry by June Jordan. Not the one that we know because she hadn't yet written it. But June Jordan, of course, will become a central protagonist in the effort to forge words and deeds of solidarity, bringing Black people in the Americas closer to the struggle in Palestine. But also from where I stand, this collection of poems by June Jordan also interrupted the otherwise masculinist resonances of the book list, because I think that every other title was authored by a man. And of course, June spoke out for Palestine at a time of reluctance, fear, capitulation to Zionism, and her words continue to echo today, linking Black feminism to Gaza, to the occupied West Bank. And I just want to share a couple of words from the poem Moving Toward Home in the collection Living Room. I need to speak about living room, where the land is not bullied and beaten into a tombstone. I need to speak about living room, where the talk will take place in my language. I need to speak about living room, where my children will grow without horror. I need to speak about living room, where the men of my family between the ages of 6 and 65 are not marched into a roundup that leads to the grave. I need to speak about living room, where I can sit without grief, without wailing aloud for my loved ones, where I must not ask, where is Abu Fadi? Because he will be there beside me. I need to talk about living room because I need to talk about home. I was born a Black woman, and now I am become a Palestinian against the relentless laughter of evil. Thank you.
That was beautiful. Really. What I'm thinking now is like I have, while you're speaking, and something in my mind was coming, and I wanted to like throw it as a question or as a thought to interact with it. Do you, Noura and Angela, think that because of the pressures of the daily life of the Black community and the Palestinian community, like from the morning, you get up and you go and you start the struggle when you're driving, when you're going to a store, when you're walking, and we know they say that for the Palestinians to say you're flying like while Black is driving, kind of bringing the similarity. And the Palestinians are living the same kind of existence from the morning till they get back to night to sleep. And it's a minute by minute struggle. Do you think that pressure kind of made our communities and our activists so self-centeredness about their issues that the self-identification was so narrow about their activism and struggle, which was a hurdle in a way in uniting the movement together about these connections and shared experiences? What do you think about that?
You want to go first, Noura?
I guess I'll share. So first of all, thank you. That was so wonderful. You're such a body of living history. In addition to providing us with brilliant analysis, I'm humbled every time. Thank you. On this question, Michel, I think about it a lot. And I think that, obviously that matters, right? And it's precisely what Angela is speaking to when she talks about the deprovincialization of our conditions and of our struggles. I'm always surprised that, in fact, these analyses are not related to, circumstance and conditions, that the person who's under the greatest pressure has the greatest analysis, right? That there isn't necessarily a direct correlation in my experience. As far as I'm concerned, as Palestinians, I'm thinking about my community, my attempts. That's what I'm, can speak on. It's the lack of leadership. It's a lack of a body. We used to have political parties that trained cadre. And that training was not just military tactics and guerrilla tactics and how to withstand torture, and how to pass on information in, indistinguishable cells or undiscoverable cells. It was political analysis. It was reading. There was rigor, right? And we do not have, neither, with all due respect to our political parties and their legacies, they do not do that work to nurture and to raise and to cultivate cadre in the same way. And in terms of a government, it's completely bereft. The political project has shifted. Our political project used to be liberation. So it made a tremendous amount of common sense to then connect to other liberation struggles and to even frame our struggle that way. Our struggle has become repackaged as one of state building, of niceties, of acquiescence, of earning the approval of our settler sovereign and their imperial patron. It's become about, how do you perform like a state where protest and even making these connections become offensive. I mean, in fairness to our Palestinian communities, and also holding criticism of them, I mean, I'm concerned that on the ground, first of all, most of the solidarity is North American specific, number one. Most of our communities in Palestine don't have this analysis, and part of it is because they're also subject to a barrage of harassment from their own government. The formal Palestinian leadership won't even endorse BDS. Imagine that they would be, educating or creating a culture of resistance that connected us to an anti-colonial spirit. I don't even think that the Palestinian leadership acknowledges or creates this analysis of colonialism to be able to make these connections. The apartheid analysis didn't come out of the PLO unit. They rescinded Zionism as racism, right? So in 1991, as a precondition for entering also. So for me, my concern is it's not the circumstance that's preventing the individual from making these connections. There is a collapse of institutional infrastructure that raised generations. I'm so surprised and proud that we've been able to do that nonetheless in informal organization, like the Free Democrat Palestine movement, like movements that are not naming themselves for fear of retaliation, like SJPs on campus who are punished, right? But so much of it is informal and very few institutions that are supporting and producing this kind of work.
Any thoughts, Dr. Davis, on the same issue? On the same point?
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm just trying to unmute in the wrong place. Yeah, I think what Noura is saying makes a great deal of sense. But at the same time, I think that moments arise. And I'm looking at the situation in the US, where no one could have predicted that the kind of mass consciousness that developed, at least for a while, around structural racism would have been possible. And that was primarily because of all of the work that small formations have been doing, over time, not because of an organization of, I mean, I think we do need a labor, feminist, anti-racist political party, which we don't have. But on the other hand, I don't know whether a party can actually create that kind of consciousness. And I think that, Stuart Hall talked about the fact that there are no guarantees for the work that we actually do. We don't know what the consequences are going to be. But sometimes there are these extraordinary historical moments that we can only take advantage of if we have been doing the work all along. Now, I have to say that I've been impressed by displays of solidarity with the Black movement emanating from Palestine. I think that Palestinians know more about the development of Black movements in the US than Black people know about the development of the Palestinian movement. So I'm going to make another argument. And as a matter of fact, what is so interesting is that when Black people discover the similarities, which Palestinians already know about, then they feel enlightened. Noura, I was just talking to Michael Bennett recently, and remembering that you asked me to contact Michael Bennett, who was a pretty well-known football player playing for the Seattle Seahawks, and to urge him not to go to Israel on the delegation that was organized for the NFL. So I suggested that he read a number of books, and his response was, I had no idea. I didn't even know. And he still talks about that moment of enlightenment now. The thing that has just so impressed me about Palestinians on the ground is the literacy and the education and the awareness of what is happening in other places. The fact that when the protest against the segregated highways that, of course, were designed to take settlers through Palestine to the settlements, and Palestinians were not allowed to even drive on them. The fact that the protests were called freedom rides. What was it?
No, you're right. They organized the freedom rides.
Yes, absolutely. Which
yes.
resonated with the freedom rides in the early 1960s throughout the South. So I see it from another vantage point. And while I totally understand your critiques, I think it is really important for the Black movement to know the extent to which Palestinians are familiar with those historical moments and have tried to bring them into current day struggles for justice in Palestine.
So if I can jump in and just say, I think it's really, really interesting, right? That Angela, you're highlighting that no, Palestinians are actually, they know more, they're more familiar. And I'm saying, I think Black communities are actually doing more. So I think for each of us, it's right to have the self-reflexive critique of wanting our communities to do more and decenter themselves and, the deprovincialization. The freedom rides you mentioned, in fact, included a young man. They were attacked, by the way, by Palestinians who thought, we don't want We don't want to, just make these roads equal. We want to dismantle the settlements. We don't want to integrate the settlements and the roads. And they included one of our martyrs, Bassel al-Arraj, who's a young Palestinian intellectual revolutionary who was assassinated in Area A, right? And which is to say nothing. I mean, for all of us who understand the critiques of these colonial jurisdictional areas, but Area A is supposed to be under the full Palestinian, political and military control, which means that it was the Palestinian Authority that facilitated his assassination, right? So I guess this also turns me to this question in this chat by a woman who has heard my critique, right? My critique of our community and wanting us to be, more mindful, right, of the Black struggle, not merely as a civil rights and an equality struggle for integration. They're not trying to make America better. They're trying to decolonize America, right? This is not a movement for equality. It's a Black freedom struggle. It's that analysis that I want to drive home. I emphasize my points, right, on that because, as discussed with Michel on this call, I thought that this was primarily a webinar for Arab Americans and Palestinians. This is the audience I'm speaking to. So I'm not sure that this woman heard what I was saying, or she's saying that I have dismissed everyone and everything and neglected the frontline resistance. I have said nothing of the sort. I have, in fact, been saying what the problem has been, that the failure of or the lack of institutions, I'm not saying we need a political party, but the lack of institutions means we're not cultivating the same kind of political analysis, and instead we're doing it in much more informal processes, which I think is so impressive how we've done it nonetheless. And I've critiqued very clearly the PA for its role, not only in not reaching out and framing Black freedom struggle, but also in selling us out completely, being co-opted by Israel. When I say the settler sovereign, that's Israel. When I say beholden to the settler sovereign and its imperial patron, I'm saying they're beholden to Israel and the United States who supports them. So I apologize to the audience if perhaps I spoke in too vague of terms that I can be misunderstood as upholding the, somehow supporting the PA and dismissing our frontline resistance. I hope that that's more clear and that the next questions come with a bit more curiosity to perhaps ask me to clarify rather than to accuse me and then make those accusations by connecting me to familial relationships. Thank you.
Well, I come from this movement. I have been active in the Palestinian work in the US since I came to America in 1975, and I attest to the lack of analysis and a lack of incorporating what we know from Black activists that has been highlighted, as I said from the beginning, from the Black liberation movement in our work. A lot of our work has been to ask others to be in solidarity with us, and we did not go out and be in solidarity with them. And I think that is a weakness that we have, because if you think about it, is we are fighting against this system. It's the same system. It's the same apparatus of oppression, the system that produces similar experiences in Palestine and in the US. And it's the same system that produces this foreign policy and domestic policy, and it's the same tactic and the same mindset. And we cannot say that we need to confront the system outside and not really confront it here at home too. It would not work. And that is a uniter by understanding that since we are the same communities fighting the same system, we should be fighting it together. And another thing in my mind is, who works hard about not letting and allowing the Black struggle and the Palestinian struggle come together is the system, is the people in power. They work hard to use tactics like Quintil Pro, they use, they deceive, they oppress to keep us separated and to keep us apart. I think that the system fears the Palestinians and the Black community coming together as a movement around the liberation of the Black community and the liberation of Palestine. They work hard, they understand it more than we do. Because I think the power of those both communities coming together will force other communities here in the US and abroad to listen to these shared experiences and identify with it and join the fight. That's the power of the Black Palestinian solidarity in the United States. It brings in, when they listen to these shared experiences, brings in other communities who are facing and experiencing the same oppression from the same source. So we need to really face this fact about the weakness that we face. And from my vantage point, I am a Palestinian activist. I need to recognize that, and I need to work with my community to do what I can to remedy this weakness that we face. So it's not, when we criticize is the right thing to do. We need to criticize, and sometimes it hurts, but we need to criticize until it hurts so we can face it. Another thing I noticed from what you mentioned, Dr. Davis, and when you said the two wings of the Black struggle, of the movement, you have the radical wing and you have the more liberal wing. And if you notice from the history, it wasn't working together. Like sometimes the radical movement is working and nothing on the liberal or the liberal side is working. But I feel today I can see both sides are working together when it comes to the Palestinian solidarity. I see the squad, Ilhan Omar and Cor Bush and Presley and the Black Lives Matter coming together, and they're speaking all from their position. That change is also came as an accumulation of the historical struggle, and I really feel very hopeful with that. What do you think?
Well, yes, I absolutely agree with you. I can remember in 2011, I think it was 2011, I participated in a meeting that was devoted to generating solidarity with the struggle in Palestine. And, what we said was that, those of us who had been close to the Palestine solidarity movement for years, and, my own activism goes back to my days as a college student at Brandeis University, by the way, which was founded in the same year as the State of Israel. But what we noted was that the issue was always separate. It was not incorporated into agendas of social justice more broadly. And I can remember very specifically at that time, a number of people committing to the process of attempting to bring the issue of ending the occupation and justice for Palestine onto the social justice, the agenda for social justice more broadly. And I think that to a certain extent, we've been successful. And to a certain extent, we haven't, because of the power of Zionist lobby. And I do think that that it's important, and perhaps I'm saying this because I've grown older, because I've been involved, for so many decades in the movement. that sometimes it does take decades to see the results of one's work. And I'm always inspired by encounters I've had with Palestinians who talk about the long struggle I'll never forget when I was in Palestine. I met this man who was a merchant who owned a store, and he said something like, "As long as there is an olive tree left, we will fight for the freedom of Palestine." And so that kind of discourse, public discourse that acknowledges the temporality of the movement is something that has inspired me to think more generationally about the Black struggle. So, there are a lot of ways in which we can perhaps see influences from one struggle to the other. But I do think that we have to engage more openly in discussions about capitalism.
Yes.
Especially at a time when the concentration of wealth is in fewer and fewer hands, in which the billionaires have sort of doubled their wealth during the pandemic alone. This is an issue that has to be, I think, placed in the forefront.
Yes, and I think is when I talked about the system and the apparatus of oppression, it boils down to the economical system. It boils down to that the wealth of the world right now is in the hand of the few, and they own the armies, they export the weapons, and racially it's in the hands of white people. So brown people and black people and people of color all over the world are perceived as a second class, if not a 10th class. They are used to increase their wealth, and anybody who asks to free themselves from that system is a target of oppression, whether here at home or whether it's in Asia or Africa or any part of the world. So it's not really about being in a certain geographical area only. It's a worldwide phenomena, and look at them. They globalized their companies, they globalized their trade, they globalized their sources of money, and they globalized their market. And we should look about us, the movement, to defeat this globalized system by being internationalized and globalized ourselves. And they use tactics. I mean, there is people right here sometimes, instead of listening and understanding and disagreeing sometimes, they go on the attack and they try to kind of skew what has been said. I'm talking about certain people on the chat right now. So, don't worry about those.
Can I add something about this? And especially if we're starting to think about, rightly so, that this idea of, capitalism needs to be a primary target, which is also, something that inflicts us internally. So one of the primary obstacles to Black liberation has been the Black middle class, right? That sees itself as beneficiaries. Similarly, we see an entirely new classes of Palestinians who have developed, even billionaires in Gaza, who can benefit from these economies. So it's important, again, that these analyses are textured or nuanced, that we can be solid, we can be unified, we can be strong, even as, right, we exercise these critiques and think about that the relationship between race and capitalism, as you highlighted, Angela, and as we've been reminded in the form of racial capitalism, is that there is no capitalism without racism. How else can we naturalize these takings, these deprivations, this exploitation, right? And then the use of state violence in order to protect that violence. And to point to other countries that are doing the same. Chile, an uprising. The Sudan is uprising. Sri Lanka, an uprising. Lebanon, an uprising against, the failure, these neoliberal crises, which actually aligns us not only with Black Palestinian solidarity here, but it does. It makes the world much bigger of what are we fighting and how are we fighting together for it.
And if we want to bring it down to the last kind of point, and then we can wrap up, is what do you think of the immediate hurdles that we face in bringing this what we have been talking about together? What are some of these hurdles that we need to tackle? Go ahead.
Angela can have the last word, and I just want to say that unfortunately, it's so easy to say what's wrong. It's so easy to say what's wrong, and that's why we have a lot of what you pointed out, Michel. This idea of wanting to point fingers, and I honestly think that if we rest on that, if that doesn't become what catapults us into action, but instead becomes a war of positions, it's a position of weakness, right? What I want to point out is where we started off this conversation, what we were talking about offline. I think the primary hurdle, especially when it comes to how we fight for Palestine from this particular, center of empire, is about, and not just here, but it's a big deal here, is the insistence on conflating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism and the concerted efforts to continue to say a lie over and over and over again until some people accept it as the truth. If you Google, is anti-Semitism, Zionism, it's just, whatever the algorithm is, it's all of the liberal Zionists who believe that, whose articles come up. There's no legacy. Nobody understands what Zionism is. Hardly anybody understands what anti-Semitism is, right? It's why people actually don't say anything, because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing, not because they're in some principled solidarity. It's horrible. It's horrible. I spent the entire, the part of last week I was sharing here, defending myself. I'm doing research on, the drafting history of Zionism as racism, right? The 1975 resolution 3379, where Hassan Saad, a Palestinian intellectual in 1965, points out the irony that Zionism emerges and develops in the same intellectual and geographical context as anti-Semitism and as Nazism. It's the irony of that Zionism is actually born in the same, milieu. And immediately now there's attacks against me that I said that Zionism is Nazism. So I have to, and we can't sue for defamation because that's legally, it's another story. Then my students were accused of anti-Semitism by the university administration because a caravan of participants in the protest happened to drive by a Jewish fraternity. And all the frat brothers had to do was call the university administration to say that there was an anti-Semitic harassment. And a statement is sent out and 3 articles are written. And then this weekend I spent defending another comrade of mine. So I do think, right, the IHRA definition, I think that I didn't think that the response to the IHRA definition and the Jerusalem definition did, neither, the response to it didn't center Palestinians in Palestine. There is still an entire field where it's incumbent upon us to have these conversations. Anti-Semitism has historically been recognized as a form of racism. Why? What do we gain by unearthing that? How do we understand that better? And how do we understand racism better, and so on and so forth? How do we grapple, right? We don't need to understand Zionism to be fair to it. We need to understand Zionism to understand exactly what it is, why it was declared a form of racism. Let us have that political analysis. But even as my experience is showing, that even trying to redevelop, right, that analysis, just going in the scholarly record, is going to be attacked. So I think that for me, all these gains, all these strides that we're making, right? Like, people who are canceling trips and delegations in solidarity with Palestinians, that the attacks on them are going to be even greater now. I want to lift that up and say that we need to be much more vigilant of how we're going to, not only be on the, assertive and the offensive, but simultaneously we have to fight this defensive war until we can make it an offensive one. How do we turn this accusation not into a defensive posture, but into an offensive one? So that's what I would say my horizon is.
I know this slogan of anti-Semitism has been weaponized as a political tool against pro-Palestinian voices and any criticism of Israel. And last word is for you, Dr. Davis.
Well, first of all, Noura, I want to thank you for raising this issue, which we began to talk about before the program began. The ways in which the accusation of anti-Semitism is thrown around and used to discredit all kinds of people. It's interesting because I've seen a lot of comments about myself that characterize me as an anti-Semite. And I'm thinking about the particular, I think you referred to it, Michel, when I was to receive a human rights award in Birmingham, Alabama by the Civil Rights Institute, and they withdrew the award because of pressure from Zionists. However, the response was so overwhelming, including in the Jewish community, that they not only withdrew that that accusation, but they reorganized the leadership of the Civil Rights Institute. They brought on a new board of trustees. They began to do some programming specifically around Palestine. And that was really an important moment. It was a moment of promise. And I fear that there have been these moments of promise that we have not been able to work through, perhaps because of the pandemic and the separations and so forth, because it seems as if, some of these accusations have become even more intense as we were compelled to kind of, withdraw and communicate only over social media and over a Zoom, which I think, in some ways, there is this way of accentuating the negative that gets produced within social media, cancel culture or whatever you want to call it. It's so much easier to make an accusation than it is to have an actual conversation with someone around an issue. So I think that we have to remember these moments of promise, and we have to try to use them as a foundation to move forward. Because there was a time when we thought that, there were new possibilities. And I don't want to say that we no longer think that, because I look at what has happened in the aftermath of the summer of 2020, and now you have these accusations of more crime has been produced precisely because of the critiques of the police, because of the fact that people are saying defund the police. Now crime is rising in communities all over the country and all over the world. And of course, that has more to do with what is happening in the economy and precisely the evictions and the concentration of wealth in the hands of billionaires than it does with any critiques of the police. So I think I want to end by urging people to think deeply about what we can do to begin to fulfill some of these moments of promise, at least to begin to do the organizing that would help us to move forward in generating the kind of solidarity, bringing Black movements and the movement for justice in Palestine together as we envision.
Well, thank you, Dr. Davis, very, very much about participating in this important conversation. I hope that we would have other opportunities to follow up on this and to try to materialize, whatever we talked about into organizing and working on the ground. Thank you, Dr. Noura, also for agreeing to be a part of this. We appreciate it very much. You're always been a leader in our community. We appreciate your voice, and you inspire all of us. And thank you for the people who attended this webinar. I hope you will be with us in future events, and keep in mind this issue. Keep in mind when we start talking about practical things, what you heard today. Have a great day, everybody, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Michel. Thank you, Angela. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you very much.